On the 22nd day of January 2024, the city of Ayodhya in northern India became the center of one of the most watched religious events on the entire planet. Within hours, more than 500,000 people passed through the gates of a newly consecrated temple, and in the weeks that followed, the crowds did not slow down. Within the first dozen days alone, more than 2 million pilgrims arrived in that one city. Analysts now project something almost impossible to believe, that this single temple could eventually become the most visited pilgrimage site on the planet, surpassing even Mecca and the Vatican in annual footfall. To put that projection in perspective, the entire surrounding region recorded roughly 50 million visitor arrivals in the year before the temple opened, and more than 150 million in the year that followed, a tripling of traffic concentrated almost entirely around one building dedicated to one figure from one ancient epic.
But behind that headline lies a layer that almost no account of ancient history ever mentions out loud. The man to whom that temple is dedicated has never been confirmed by a single inscription carved in stone, a single coin bearing his name, or a single trustworthy archaeological artifact. And yet he became, without any real competition, the most powerful figure ever produced by Indian civilization, more powerful than any general, more influential than any king who ever physically ruled that land. What follows will trace how a character who may never have existed as one historical individual managed, across more than 2,000 years, to shape morality, architecture, dance, geopolitics, and even modern infrastructure spending across an entire continent. Near the end, this account will also resolve a true mystery, a bridge visible in satellite photographs that still divides scientists and believers today. Stay with this account to the end, because the answer is genuinely surprising. Before going further, a sincere and humble request. This is a small, independent project, built on careful research rather than spectacle. If you find value in this kind of work, subscribing, leaving a like, writing a comment, and sharing this with someone who also loves history and archaeology would mean a great deal and would help this project keep existing. Thank you honestly for being here. Now back to Ayodhya. When the research for this project began with a simple question, who was the greatest hero produced by Indian civilization, a curious fork in the road appeared almost immediately. On one side stand heroes that history can verify with real confidence. Ashoka and Chandragupta Maurya, founders of the Mauryan Empire, left behind stone edicts, inscribed pillars, and coins bearing their names. Chandragupta built an empire stretching across most of the subcontinent with the help of his strategist Chanakya and the Greek diplomat Megasthenes, who visited the Mauryan capital directly, left written descriptions of a fortified city of timber palisades, wide avenues, and a sophisticated civil administration that still survive as some of the earliest outside eyewitness accounts of Indian governance. Punch-marked silver coins bearing official Mauryan symbols, along with seals and weights recovered from sites across northern India, give archaeologists physical, datable confirmation of the empire's reach that no epic poem can ever fully provide. Ashoka, Chandragupta's grandson, left dozens of edicts carved into rock faces and tall sandstone pillars across the subcontinent, describing his renunciation of violent conquest after witnessing the brutality of the Kalinga War and his subsequent embrace of Buddhist principles of nonviolence. The lion capital that once crowned one of Ashoka's pillars at Sarnath is, today, reproduced directly on the national emblem of the modern Republic of India, stamped on every passport and rupee note in the country, a rare case of a fully verified ancient ruler's personal monument becoming part of a nation's everyday visual identity. These men are, without serious dispute, the architects who physically built the Indian state as we understand it today. On the other side of that fork stand heroes who belong to an entirely different territory, the territory of epic and living legend. Rama and Krishna are the two most important names in that second group. Neither one possesses as of today any archaeological evidence confirming their existence as single historical individuals within a verifiable timeline. And here is the first point that very few accounts discuss openly: the influence these unverifiable heroes have had on the identity of hundreds of millions of people is, despite the total absence of hard proof, far greater than the influence of any fully documented emperor. That is precisely why this account chooses Rama as its subject, not because he conquered territory, but because he shaped something far harder to conquer: the very definition of what it means to be a righteous person. To understand why Rama occupies such a unique place, it helps to compare him, even briefly, with Krishna. Krishna is the master of complex philosophy and transcendence, the central voice of the sacred text known as the Bhagavad Gita, where he teaches about duty, the nature of the soul, and the ultimate meaning of existence. Krishna is playful, strategic, sometimes morally ambiguous, willing to bend rules in service of a larger cosmic order. Rama is something different. Indian tradition describes him with a title usually translated as the ideal man, someone who follows the rules of righteous conduct, even when following those rules costs him everything he loves. Within the wider Hindu tradition of the 10 principal incarnations of the god Vishnu, known as the Dashavatara, Rama and Krishna are considered the two most fully developed and most beloved human forms, yet they represent two almost opposite models of virtue, one built on strict duty, the other on flexible wisdom. Hindu cosmology divides time into 4 vast recurring ages called yugas, each one longer and morally darker than the one before it. Tradition places Rama's life within the third of these ages, the Treta Yuga, a period imagined as still relatively close to a golden moral order, which is itself part of why his story carries such weight as a model of near-perfect conduct, lived just before the world's ethical decline accelerated. Rama is also frequently called Raghava, a name pointing back to Raghu, a celebrated ancestor several generations earlier within the same solar dynasty, the Surya Vansha, said to descend ultimately from Manu, the first human being in Hindu tradition. Lineage of this kind mattered enormously in the world the epic describes. A king was never simply himself. He was the latest link in a chain of ancestors whose reputation he was expected to extend rather than tarnish. Royal genealogies of this type, real or partly invented, served a clear social function across many ancient cultures, anchoring a ruler's legitimacy not in personal achievement alone, but in an unbroken line stretching back towards something close to sacred origin. And the Ikshvaku line into which Rama was born is, within the tradition, presented as one of the very oldest and most continuous such lines in existence. The story of Rama, told in the epic called the Ramayana, did not remain confined to India. It crossed borders, oceans, and centuries, becoming the cultural foundation of a large part of Southeast Asia, including Thailand, Indonesia, and Cambodia. Rama became simultaneously the archetype of the ideal king, the devoted son, and the righteous warrior. That triple identity is exactly what this account will now examine, piece by piece. The first step of any serious investigation is separating 3 layers that are constantly blurred together without care. The first layer is historical fact, and historical fact, stated plainly, is that there is no archaeological evidence of a king named Rama living at the date traditionally assigned to him many thousands of years ago. The second layer is literary tradition. The Ramayana, composed by the poet Valmiki, is classified within Indian culture itself as an itihasa, a term that translates loosely as "so it happened," designating an epic chronicle distinct from a Purana, which tends toward cosmology and mythic history on a far larger cosmic scale, and distinct as well from pure invented fiction. The third layer is religious belief, within which Rama is considered the 7th incarnation of the god Vishnu. Facing these 3 layers, historians such as the British scholar Arthur Llewellyn Basham and the Indian historian Romila Thapar proposed a fascinating hypothesis that the myth of Rama might be a synthesis of folk memories belonging to real tribal chieftains of the late Vedic period, or perhaps a poetic metaphor describing the expansion of Indo-Aryan culture toward the south of India. This idea connects to a much larger and genuinely contested academic debate about how Indo-Aryan speaking peoples arrived in or developed within the subcontinent in the second millennium before the Common Era. Mainstream linguistic and genetic scholarship generally supports a gradual migration of Indo-Aryan speakers into South Asia from Central Asia, while a smaller group of scholars, often associated with what is called the out-of-India theory, argues instead that Indo-Aryan languages and culture originated within India itself and spread outward. Both positions have committed defenders, and both carry real political weight inside India today, so this account presents the debate honestly rather than declaring a winner. In other words, Rama may never have been a single person, but may instead be the accumulated weight of many real human stories, fused across generations into one unforgettable figure, and that fusion paradoxically may explain why he became so powerful. A collective symbol almost always carries more weight than a single historical individual ever could. According to tradition, Rama was born in and ruled the kingdom of Kosala, whose capital was the city of Ayodhya. Archaeological excavations carried out at the site of Ayodhya confirm continuous human occupation going back at least to the 7th century before the Common Era. But here is one of the most delicate points in this entire investigation. Those excavations have not produced any palace or structure consistent with the Bronze Age setting the epic describes. What exists instead is a much more recent and far more turbulent layer of history. In the 16th century of the Common Era, the Mughal Emperor Babur ordered the construction, on that exact plot of land, of a mosque that became known as the Babri Masjid. For generations, many Hindus maintained that this was the precise birthplace of Rama, and that a temple had stood there and been destroyed before the mosque was built. This became one of the longest-running religious disputes in modern Indian history, with the first recorded legal filing dating back to the year 1885. In 1992, crowds demolished the mosque entirely, triggering waves of communal violence across the country that left thousands dead. In 2003, under direct order from the Allahabad High Court, the Archaeological Survey of India carried out a major excavation at the site, employing more than 100 laborers over several months. Their report described traces of a massive pre-existing structure beneath the mosque's foundations, including carved stone fragments bearing lotus motifs and other ornamentation typically associated with northern Indian temple architecture, along with pillar bases and an inscription fragment. The report concluded these remains were consistent with a large religious structure, likely from around the 12th century, of what it called Hindu religious origin. That conclusion has not gone unchallenged. Other archaeologists, including Dr. D. Mandal and Dr. Shireen Ratnagar, published a detailed counter-analysis arguing that the so-called pillar bases actually belonged to several unrelated structural phases built at different times, that they were never strong enough to support a roof, and that the survey's methods were rushed and shaped by a predetermined conclusion. This scholarly disagreement remains unresolved among archaeologists even today, even though it was the official report, not the academic rebuttal, that the courts ultimately relied upon. In 2019, the Supreme Court of India issued a final and definitive ruling, granting that disputed land to the Hindu community for the construction of a temple, and directing that a separate plot nearby be granted to the Muslim community for the construction of a new mosque. It was on precisely that contested ground that the Ram Mandir temple was inaugurated on that 22nd day of January 2024, mentioned at the very beginning of this account. In other words, the story of Rama is not a closed chapter of antiquity. It continues right now, reorganizing maps, political tensions, and enormous flows of investment in contemporary India. The temple itself stands roughly 161 feet tall, built mostly from pink sandstone in the traditional Nagara style, without a single piece of structural iron. Its stone blocks fused together using thousands of copper plates rather than metal beams. The surrounding urban transformation of the city, including new airport facilities, an upgraded railway station, and a wave of hotel construction, has already been estimated at more than $10 billion, with regional tourism numbers jumping from roughly 50 million visitors in the year before the opening to well over 150 million the year after. The temple has already produced its own modern ritual innovations as well. During the first Ram Navami festival celebrated there after consecration, marking the traditional date of Rama's birth, engineers used a precisely calculated optical mechanism to channel a beam of sunlight onto the forehead of the temple's central idol at exactly midday, a modern technological tribute layered directly on top of an ancient devotional calendar. Even in the very recent past, the temple complex has kept growing, with a large ceremonial installation completed inside its second floor in March of this year, and a second major consecration ceremony held there in the middle of last year. Whatever one believes about Rama's historical existence, the cultural and economic gravity surrounding his name has, if anything, only grown stronger in the last 2 years. Before any of those later episodes unfold, the epic first establishes how Rama came into the world at all. King Dasharatha, ruler of Kosala, had 3 wives but no living heir, and tradition describes him performing an elaborate fire sacrifice, the Putrakamechi Yagna, after which each of his wives is said to have received a portion of a sacred offering. From that offering, 4 sons were born: Rama to Queen Kaushalya, Bharata to Queen Kaikeyi, and the twins Lakshmana and Shatrugna to Queen Sumitra. Rama and Lakshmana grow especially close, a bond that defines much of the rest of the story. Meanwhile, in the neighboring kingdom of Mithila, King Janaka discovers an infant girl while plowing a sacred field, names her Sita, and raises her as his own daughter, a detail that later earns her the epithet Daughter of the Earth, an image that will return with unexpected weight at the very end of her story. When Sita comes of age, Janaka announces a contest for her hand in marriage, a ceremony known as a Swayamvara, built around an enormous and famously unlifeable bow that once belonged to the god Shiva. Suitor after suitor fails even to move it. When the young Rama steps forward and not only lifts the bow but bends and breaks it in the attempt to string it, the marriage is sealed on the spot. It is a small detail but a telling one. The relationship that anchors the entire epic begins not with conquest, but with a contest of effort witnessed by an entire court. Returning to the epic narrative itself, 3 central episodes carry almost the entire moral architecture of Rama's story. The first is the exile, called in Sanskrit the Vanavasa. Rama was the rightful heir to the throne of Kosala, but to honor a promise his father, King Dasharatha, had made to one of his wives, Rama agrees to give up everything: the palace, the comfort, the certainty of kingship, and walk into the forest for 14 years. He is accompanied by his devoted wife Sita and his loyal younger brother Lakshmana. Back in Ayodhya, the news of Rama's exile devastates King Dasharatha, who dies of grief shortly afterward. Bharata, who had been away at the time of these events and had no part in his mother Kaikeyi's scheme to secure his succession, returns home and is horrified to learn what has happened in his absence. Rather than accept the throne for himself, Bharata travels into the forest to beg Rama to come back and rule. Rama refuses, unwilling to break his father's word even after his father's death. As a compromise, Bharata carries Rama's sandals back to Ayodhya and places them on the throne, ruling the kingdom for the next 14 years only as a regent in Rama's name, refusing every royal comfort himself in solidarity with his exiled brother. It is a quieter act than anything Rama himself does in the forest, and many readers over the centuries have considered it just as morally significant. Their years of exile take Rama, Sita, and Lakshmana through real and richly described landscapes: the hermitage of Chitrakuta, the deep woods of Panchavati, and a string of encounters with sages, hermits, and forest-dwelling communities. One of the most dramatic episodes along the way involves Ravana's sister Shurpanakha, who falls for Rama, is rejected and in her fury provokes a chain of events that eventually draws Ravana's full attention toward Sita. That single gesture, the choice to honor a promise over personal ambition, became, across the centuries, the most frequently cited pillar of Indian morality, the idea that a given word matters more than any personal gain. The second episode is the war against the kingdom of Lanka, ruled by the ten-headed king Ravana, who abducts Sita after luring Rama and Lakshmana away with the trick of a golden deer, actually Ravana's shape-shifting ally Marisha in disguise. For researchers, this conflict is rarely read as a simple battle between absolute good and absolute evil. It most likely represents in symbolic form the encounter and collision between the Vedic culture of northern India and older, highly complex cultures of the south, possibly of Dravidian or tribal origin. And this is exactly where one of the most fascinating elements of the entire epic enters the story. An army of forest-dwelling beings resembling monkeys, called the Vanaras, led by the loyal and nearly indestructible Hanuman, who becomes decisive in the final battle. On the way toward Lanka, Rama strikes an alliance essential to the entire war effort. The Vanara king Sugriva had been driven from his own throne by his older brother Vali, who additionally claimed Sugriva's wife for himself. Rama agrees to help Sugriva reclaim his kingdom in exchange for the future support of his monkey army, and during the ensuing duel between the two brothers, Rama kills Vali with an arrow shot from concealment rather than in open combat. This single decision remains one of the most debated moral moments in the entire epic, with traditional commentaries offering elaborate justifications rooted in royal duty and prior wrongdoing, while many readers across the centuries, including respected poets and philosophers, have openly questioned whether the ideal man of the epic acted ideally in that particular moment. It is one of several places where the supposedly perfect hero is shown making a choice that later generations have felt entirely comfortable arguing about, rather than simply accepting in silence because the hero in question happened to be a god. Hanuman, once allied to Rama, leaps across the strait separating India from Lanka, scouts Ravana's fortress alone, and at one point sets a portion of the city ablaze with his own burning tail. Later in the war, when Lakshmana is gravely wounded, Hanuman flies to a distant mountain and carries back, on his own shoulders, an entire hillside of medicinal herbs known as Sanjivani, just to save his ally's life. The conflict is further complicated and made considerably less black and white by the figure of Vibhishana, Ravana's own brother, who breaks with his king on moral grounds and defects to Rama's side, becoming a trusted ally and eventually the new ruler of Lanka after Ravana's defeat. Ravana himself deserves more nuance than the simple label of villain usually allows. Within the Ramayana, he is also described as a devout follower of the god Shiva, a brilliant scholar of the four Vedas, a gifted musician, and, according to later traditions, the master of a flying chariot called the Pushpaka Vimana, and the reputed author of texts on astrology, pulse diagnosis, and the science of distillation and herbal medicine. Even at the moment of his death, the epic has Rama instruct his own brother to show Ravana the proper funeral rites owed to a learned man. This complexity has had a long afterlife outside India as well. In Sri Lanka, where Ravana is traditionally remembered as the ancient ruler of the island, and where caves and waterfalls across the central highlands are still pointed to today as the places he is said to have hidden Sita, a modern cultural movement among Sinhala Buddhists, and a separate but related movement among Tamil communities, have spent the last century reclaiming Ravana as a wise, indigenous, and even heroic king rather than a demon, framing Rama's invasion as a story of northern conquest rather than divine justice. Neither reading erases the other. Both exist in active tension inside the same epic. The third episode is the establishment of what tradition calls Rama Raja, the ideal reign marked by absolute justice and a near total absence of poverty and suffering. To this day, when an Indian political leader wants to describe a perfect government, that exact phrase is often the one chosen, a concept famously invoked by Mahatma Gandhi himself as a symbol of an ethical, not necessarily religious, ideal society he hoped India could become after independence. When Rama finally returns to Ayodhya after the war and the 14 years of exile, the city is said to have welcomed him by lighting rows of small oil lamps along every street and rooftop, lighting the way home in the darkness of a new moon night. That single image, an entire city glowing with lamps to welcome a king home, is the origin story still told today for Diwali, the festival of lights, now celebrated by hundreds of millions of people across India and the wider Indian diaspora, every single year, regardless of how anyone resolves the historical questions surrounding Rama himself. Another thread running through the whole narrative is the symbolism of Rama's weapons. His bow, called the Kodanda, is described as nearly indestructible, functioning within the tradition as a metaphor for absolute focus and precision of will. Beyond the bow, the texts describe divine weapons called astras, granted to Rama by sages such as Vishvamitra, and culminating in the devastating Brahmastra, the weapon that ultimately ends Ravana's life. These weapons do not function like ordinary swords or spears. They are activated through mantras, meaning through precise sound and vibration. For researchers, this detail reveals something important about how ancient civilizations imagined the highest form of power, not as brute force, but as sacred knowledge, controlled by the right words, spoken at the right moment. And this is exactly where the story reaches its most astonishing layer. The layer that justifies calling Rama the single greatest example of quiet cultural power in the whole of ancient history. In Thailand, the epic was adapted into a local version called the Ramayana, and that influence runs so deep that the royal dynasty still ruling the country today, the Chakri dynasty, traditionally names its kings using the very name Rama. The current Thai monarch is formally titled Rama X. Scenes from the epic cover the walls of the Temple of the Emerald Buddha in Bangkok in extraordinary painted detail, stretching across an entire perimeter wall and repainted by royal command across multiple reigns. In Indonesia, the island of Java produced its own poetic adaptation of the epic, known as the Kakawin Ramayana, and its scenes are carved into the stone reliefs of Prambanan, one of the largest Hindu temple complexes ever built in Southeast Asia. On the island of Bali, a ritual dance called the Kecak, performed collectively at dusk by dozens of men chanting in trance, is based entirely on this same narrative. In Cambodia, the complex of Angkor Wat, among the largest religious monuments ever constructed by human beings, contains entire galleries of stone reliefs carved specifically to narrate scenes from the War of Lanka. In Malaysia, an old court tradition known as the Hikayat Seri Rama gave the epic its own distinctly Malay literary form. In Laos, the same story survives as the Fralak Fralam. In Myanmar, it became the Yama Zatado, performed for centuries as classical court theater. Pause for a moment and consider the actual scale of that. A character whose individual historical existence has never been confirmed by a single archaeological artifact nonetheless managed to define the naming convention of royal dynasties, inspire sacred trance dances, and cover the walls of temples across at least 6 different countries, sustained continuously for well over 1,000 years. No general, no emperor, no figure fully confirmed by Indian archaeology has ever achieved a comparable level of lasting cultural reach. The reach does not stop at the edges of Southeast Asia either. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, hundreds of thousands of indentured laborers left India for sugar plantations in Fiji, Mauritius, Trinidad, Guyana, and South Africa, and they carried Tulsidas's version of the epic with them as one of the very few possessions that could survive the journey intact, a recited memory rather than a physical object. Today, public recitations of that same text remain a central religious and cultural anchor for Indian-descended communities on islands and coastlines thousands of miles from Ayodhya, in some cases preserved more faithfully there, across generations of forced migration, than in parts of India itself. Modern theorists of international relations have a specific term for influence that spreads this way, without armies, treaties, or formal political pressure. Soft power, the ability of a culture to shape how distant peoples think and behave, simply through ideas, stories, and shared practice. Judged purely by that modern standard, centuries before the term itself existed, Rama may be the single most successful soft power export any pre-modern civilization ever produced, more durable across time and geography than any currency, any trade route, or any military alliance built during the same 2,000 years. Inside India itself, that same gravity shows up in far more ordinary places too. Rama remains one of the most common male-given names anywhere in the country. The simple greeting Ram Ram is still used as a daily salutation across large parts of northern India, and place names carrying some form of his name appear on maps from the Himalayan foothills to the southern coast. Few historical or mythological figures anywhere in the world leave that particular kind of fingerprint, not in monuments alone, but in the small, repeated rhythms of everyday speech. That finally brings this account to the bridge promised at the very start. Between the southern coast of India and the island of Sri Lanka lies a long, narrow geological formation, visible even in satellite imagery, traditionally known as Rama's Bridge or Adam's Bridge. Geological science explains the formation as a natural chain of sandbanks and limestone shoals, built up by coastal currents and shifting sediment over thousands of years. When a satellite image of the formation circulated widely online in the early 2000s under a dramatic caption describing it as an ancient engineered bridge, the claim spread quickly across email forwards and early websites. The space agency whose imagery had been used later issued a public clarification stating that the photograph showed nothing more than a naturally occurring chain of shoals, the kind of formation that exists in coastal waters worldwide, and that it had never claimed the structure was artificial. Religious tradition, by contrast, holds that this very structure was built by Rama's own army under the engineer Nala to cross the sea and reach Lanka. This particular debate is far from a quiet academic curiosity. It has reached Indian courtrooms directly, tied to real political disputes over a proposed shipping canal project that would have required dredging straight through the formation, a project ultimately shelved largely because of the religious and environmental sensitivity surrounding the site. It stands as a near-perfect example of how the line between geology and faith in India remains genuinely, actively alive in the 21st century. On the chronology of the text itself, scholars generally suggest that the core composition of the Ramayana, in the form most widely read today, took shape somewhere between 500 years before the Common Era and 200 years after it. Although the oral tradition behind the story is considerably older than that, textual scholars have also noted that the work grew substantially over time, with statistical analysis of the verses suggesting the earliest core version may have contained roughly half the number of verses found in the much longer text that survives in modern critical editions, with the opening and closing sections often singled out as later additions to an originally shorter heroic narrative. Within India itself, the story did not stay frozen in Valmiki's original Sanskrit. In the 16th century, the poet Tulsidas composed an entirely new retelling in the Awadhi language, the Ramcharitmanas, written specifically so that ordinary people who could not read Sanskrit could access the story directly, framed within the devotional bhakti movement that emphasized personal love for a chosen deity over priestly ritual. For most Hindus across northern India today, it is Tulsidas's version, not Valmiki's, that they grew up hearing recited aloud. In the south, the poet Kamban produced his own 12th century Tamil retelling, the Kambaramayanam, considered one of the towering achievements of Tamil literature, with its own distinct emphasis and emotional tone.
Telugu, Bengali, Odia, Kashmiri, and Malayalam literary traditions each produced significant versions of their own, often shifting emphasis toward local geography, local deities woven into the margins of the story, or distinctly regional ideas about devotion and duty, so that no single translation, including Valmiki's own Sanskrit original, can honestly claim to be the one definitive Ramayana experienced by Indians as a whole. Every autumn, communities across northern India stage Ram Leela, an open-air dramatic performance of the entire epic recognized by UNESCO as part of humanity's intangible cultural heritage, culminating during the festival of Dussehra in the public burning of a towering effigy of Ravana, sometimes built several stories tall, watched by enormous crowds in city squares. When state television broadcast its own dramatized version of the epic across India in the late 1980s, the series became one of the most watched programs in television history anywhere in the world at that time, reportedly emptying streets across the country during its weekly broadcast slot. Beyond television and traditional theater, the story has also become one of the most frequently adapted narratives in Indian cinema, from early silent productions in the 1910s through a long line of devotional films across the 20th century to large-scale modern animated and live-action productions released within the last few years alone, each one reigniting public conversation about how faithfully, or how freely, a sacred epic should be reinterpreted for a contemporary audience. The same gravitational pull that filled streets in front of television sets in the 20th century is, by every visible measure, the same pull now filling pilgrim queues outside the Ram Mandir today.
Curiously, not every religious tradition in India tells the story the same way. Ancient Buddhist texts, including one known as the Dasharatha Jataka, present an alternative version in which Rama appears as a bodhisattva, a being on the path toward enlightenment, rather than as a direct incarnation of a Hindu deity, and in which several of the epic's more dramatic and violent elements are notably softened or removed. The Jain tradition tells its own version as well, most famously in a text called the Paumakarya, composed by the monk Vimalasuri roughly in the 4th or 5th century of the Common Era. In that retelling, Ravana is recast as a noble and learned king of the Vijayadhara people, rather than a demon. The epic's miraculous elements are toned down in favor of a more rationalized account, and the narrative places far greater emphasis on themes of non-violence and renunciation consistent with Jain philosophy. The simple existence of three entirely distinct religious versions of the same essential story, Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain, shows how a single character could be legitimately reinterpreted by completely different belief systems within the same region of the world. Scholars of comparative mythology have long pointed out how closely Rama's arc follows a pattern found in hero narratives across entirely unconnected civilizations: a privileged birth, a call into hardship, a period of exile and trial, a decisive confrontation with a powerful antagonist, and a difficult return home that is never quite as simple as victory alone. Researchers have identified roughly that same underlying pattern in stories ranging from ancient Mesopotamia to medieval Europe. What makes Rama's version of that pattern unusual is not its shape, but its afterlife. Very few heroes built from that same narrative skeleton ever became the literal namesake of a currently reigning royal family on the far side of an ocean, or the central figure of a national holiday observed by hundreds of millions of people every single year. A handful of genuine mysteries remain unresolved by any researcher to date. The first is purely linguistic. Why do the versions of the Ramayana told in northern India differ so drastically from the versions told across Southeast Asia, to the point of changing endings, characters, and even the basic moral of the story? The second is archaeological. To this day, no excavation has ever turned up material remains of the so-called Golden City of Lanka, described in the epic with such extravagant detail. And the third mystery is not archaeological at all. It is deeply human, and it concerns the epic's own ending. After Rama and Sita returned triumphantly to Ayodhya, later sections of the text, generally considered later additions by textual scholars, describe Rama subjecting Sita to a public test of her fidelity by fire, the Agni Pariksha, simply because rumors had spread among his subjects during her long captivity in Lanka. Sita passes the trial unharmed, yet later, while pregnant, she is quietly banished to the forest anyway, after Rama overhears further public doubt about her honor, choosing the expectations of his kingship over his private loyalty to his wife. She spends years raising their twin sons, Lava and Kusha, alone at the forest hermitage of the very sage Valmiki who composed the epic. And when the family is eventually reunited and Rama asks her to prove her purity once more before his court, Sita, the daughter of the earth, instead calls upon the earth itself to receive her and disappears into it forever rather than submit to another public trial. Modern readings of the epic, including a substantial wave of retellings written from Sita's own point of view over the past several decades, have increasingly questioned how much real agency and voice the original text actually grants her, even as it places her suffering and loyalty at the emotional center of the entire story. Rama is perhaps the only major hero of antiquity forced to choose so visibly and so repeatedly between public duty as king and private love for the one person who followed him into exile by choice, and that very choice produces one of the most quietly devastating endings in all of ancient literature. So, returning to the question that opened this account, why did a character with no single inscription in stone, no single coin, no direct archaeological proof, become more powerful than any fully documented emperor in Indian history? The answer is exactly this. Emperors like Ashoka conquered territory. Rama, or rather the collective idea that the name Rama came to represent, conquered something no army can ever permanently occupy, the intimate personal definition of what it means to act rightly. While political borders rose and disappeared across 2,500 years, the question Rama embodies, what do I do when duty and desire collide, remains entirely alive, inside newly opened temples, inside Balinese trance dances, inside Cambodian stone reliefs, and inside the very name of a Thai royal dynasty that still reigns today. For that reason, after everything traced here, the conclusion stands: Rama is not simply the greatest hero of Indian civilization. He is, in all likelihood, the most durable mirror humanity has ever built for itself. To keep asking what it actually means to be just, what it costs to keep a promise, and what is lost, even by the most righteous person imaginable, when duty and love are finally forced to choose between each other. Empires rise on armies and treaties, and almost all of them eventually fall the same way. Whatever Rama actually was, a real chieftain remembered imperfectly, a fusion of many real lives, or a purely literary invention designed from the very beginning to teach an entire civilization how to behave, the result has outlasted every fortress, every dynasty, and every coin minted in his era, and shows no sign, 2,500 years later, of losing any of that strength. If this research meant something to you, this is exactly the kind of work this small project keeps trying to do, presenting both sides of every real debate, sourcing facts carefully, without sensationalism and without easy simplifications. If you can subscribe, leave a like, write a comment describing what stood out the most, and share this with someone who loves history and archaeology, you would be directly helping this project continue to exist. From the bottom of our hearts, thank you for staying until the very end. This kind of long, carefully sourced research takes considerable time to put together properly, and every single person who stays until this point makes that time feel worthwhile. And since this subject is genuinely enormous, with hundreds of different versions of the Ramayana spread across more than 2,000 years of history, let us know in the comments, would you rather the next deep dive explore the Buddhist version, the traditional Brahmanical version, or the many Southeast Asian retellings? Your choice decides the next chapter of this investigation.